You mentioned earlier that the future of NATO might come into question, and this is interesting because Elon Musk has been also on Twitter. What his role is in the U.S. government is still unclear, but nonetheless, he's brought up this idea that why we're still drawn into this. The Europeans have their coastal endeavor. This is preventing us from pursuing our actual interests. Now, it's been my personal hope for 30 plus years that. The NATO would be converted into an inclusive European security architecture as opposed to being a hegemonic project, constructing Europe without Russia, which becomes a Europe against Russia. Uh, but uh, but but what happens now? Because if it's not going to be an instrument in more towards surrounding Russia, what is the purpose? In the 90s, we had slogans like "expand or die," "out of area" or "out of business." Do you see a possibility that NATO will lose its purpose and even collapse as the interests of its member states begin to diverge more and more? And if it's not going to be used only as an instrument against the Russians?
NATO lost its purpose in 1990. The Warsaw Pact was ended. NATO should have been ended. NATO certainly lost its purpose in December 1991. The Soviet Union was dismembered. I happened to be around those days rather intensively. There was no risk whatsoever of any kind of a Russian invasion of Europe. NATO should have been ended then. It became something completely different from a defense against a Soviet invasion. It became the instrument in Western Eurasia for the American hegemonic project. This was not NATO's purpose up until 1990. NATO's purpose, whatever one thinks, was to face off against the Soviet Union in Western Europe. But it became, as an expansionary uh, organization, precisely and explicitly part of the American unipolarity and American hegemony and American police enforcement powers. And it was used in this way repeatedly. So I think that NATO has been misguided for more than 30 years. Uh, right now, it's fraught with the problems. One is the United States, rightly under Donald Trump, is saying, well, those 30 years of adventurism, of expansion, uh, are over. They failed. They were dangerous. They were costly. We're not doing it anymore. The Europeans are supposedly in panic over this, but they should get a grip and understand what's been said. The United States did not say NATO is over. The United States said NATO will not expand further. So this is one big point. Trump is also saying a second point, which is Europe has to spend more on its own defense. By the way, I favor a European common defense. This is the right approach. That may mean another percentage point of GDP in spending. I don't think it's 5% of GDP. That's if you're going to war, but no one should go to war. But to have a proper deterrence and a proper military force in Europe might be 3% of GDP right now. Okay, that's fine. Do it. But that's different from NATO. Will NATO, in the form of Article 5, guarantees that the United States would swoop in to a European war, still apply? Well, this is where I say in 10 years we may not have NATO. If the Europeans act as stupidly as their leaders are speaking right now, NATO will end. If Starmer and Macron continue to beat the war drums and actually perhaps even mean it, that they're going to unilaterally place troops on the ground in Ukraine, this would accelerate the end of NATO because the United States political scene and public will not say, My God, they had a chance for peace, but they went to war, and we're supposed to defend them if they're attacked in return? No way. The United States absolutely would lose interest because the US doesn't want to get into World War III. So if Starmer and Macron persist in the way they're persisting right now, they're accelerating the end of NATO. Now, one could say, oh, that's their Machiavellian plot. I don't think so. I don't think there's anything clever about what they're doing, but that is the inadvertent result of their actions.
But just a very quick last question. You mentioned before that you do speak sometimes with some Western political leaders, and what do they say actually is the objective here? Because again, Starmer's talking about a coalition of the willing. Macron says he doesn't care what Moscow thinks about peacekeepers, European peacekeepers, even though Russia will target them. Beyond this, beating their chest, is this to try to sabotage the peace agreement? Is it try to make Europe relevant by elevating its voice and heightening the stakes, or are they actually preparing for war without sufficient troops? Do they have any insight or tell you anything that makes any of this seem rational? Or
Twice in the last week, uh, I heard once from an official, once from a senior thinker in Europe, the statement, "Oh, Jeff, why do you take uh, these protestations of NATO enlargement so seriously? We know that NATO's not going to enlarge to Ukraine." I heard this twice in the last week. I went back and looked at, there are no doubt dozens. I collected around 20 very high level statements in recent months where solemnly it was stated that NATO will expand to Ukraine. So, according to two times what I heard last week, the public statements are just lies, and that private statements are very different. I asked both times, what's the purpose of this public lying? This is a degradation of democracy and very dangerous in my view. I feel I did not hear a good answer to this. Uh, is this Europeans cleverly stirring up fear to raise the defense budget? Is it Europeans trying to become heroic figures because they lack public support in their countries? Is it laziness because we have Article 10 of the NATO treaty, which claims an open door so no one can say otherwise? Uh, is it naivete? To my mind, it's lying. It is in private, they say one thing, and in public, they say another thing. This kind of lying can get us all killed, as far as I'm concerned. Uh, Leaders should tell the truth. Really. I'm not talking about a tactical military maneuver from morning till afternoon. I'm talking about high policy that's stated and restated and restated. If they believe privately something different from what they're saying in public, they need absolutely to stop the lying. If they really believe that NATO will enlarge, they need to get their heads examined, frankly, because they don't understand anything that's going on. My take is that they're lying. Uh, and I am aware that politicians lie, but lying on something of such gravity and consequence and so repeatedly over a period of decades, and even in the context of war and risk of nuclear war, is unacceptable.
agree. Anyways, I've already taken too much of your time, so Professor Sachs, it's always a great pleasure to speak with you, and thank you for your
Likewise.
insight. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Bye bye.